With dozens of sequels, spin-offs, and remakes, Castlevania is easily one of the longest-running and most enduring horror franchises in video game history. But with so many installments, it's easy to miss some of the hidden gems. I feel that that's what happened with Bloodlines, the first and only Castlevania game to find its way to the Sega Genesis. I've always been a big fan of the 16-bit sequel and wanted to spend a few minutes highlighting John and Eric's incredible journey. Turn back now if you don't want to know what happens next, because today we're going to spoil the story and endings for Castlevania Bloodlines on the Genesis. This is Game Over, the early years. When you think Castlevania, you probably picture men with whips fighting Dracula long before the Age of Enlightenment. But Bloodlines bucks that trend by fast-forwarding the series to the 20th century, 1917 to be exact. It's the story of John Morris, the son of the last hero to successfully defeat Dracula. He, along with his good friend Eric Lecard, witnessed the brutal fight back in 1897, and they've spent the last 20 years vowing to protect the planet from the evil creatures of the underworld. What John and Eric weren't counting on was Elizabeth Bartley, the long-lost niece of Dracula, who was found guilty of being a vampire back in 1421. Unfortunately, an amateur witch named Drolta accidentally resurrects Elizabeth, who returns to the war-torn world with only one goal: to give Uncle Dracula new life. Drolta's magic spell also had the unintended consequence of luring John and Eric towards the ominous castle. With all the pieces in place, it's finally time for the bloodlines to cross. John's adventure starts right where his father's story ended. The two friends begin their long journey at the ruins of the castle Dracula in Romania, which turns out to still be infected by the evil monsters and ghouls. This is a long level that eventually leads to the Atlantis Shrine in Greece, which Google Maps tells me is about 700 miles away and a 226-hour walk. Anyway, this is a really cool stage where the water actually starts to become an actual hindrance. We use the statues and the stairways to avoid the encroaching water and continue our fight against Elizabeth. Our next stop is the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy, which is another 275 hours of walking, and apparently quite a bit of swimming. This is a really cool stage that shows the tower from a bunch of different points of view. Perhaps my favorite is when the whole thing starts swaying back and forth. There's also a cool bit where we have to leave the tower in order to jump on a bunch of floating platforms. It all ends with an epic fight against a bat at the very top of the tower. Up next is a trip to a munitions plant in Germany, which is where we start to see the elements of the First World War creep into Castlevania. This is a challenging factory setting where the gears both work for and against you in equal measure. From there we go to the Palace of Versailles in France, which is yet another fun historical location on our sightseeing tour. Unfortunately, the palace has seen better days. What with the fountains flowing blood and a giant moth creature waiting for us at the end. The good news is that John and Eric both know that they only have one more stop before defeating Elizabeth. The bad news is the castle of Proserpina is all the way up in England, which is another 100 hours of walking. That's plenty of time for the evil vampire to unleash her plan to resurrect her even deadlier uncle. Time is obviously of the essence, so we fight through the castle as quickly as possible in order to stop Elizabeth. She ultimately puts up a good fight, but the writing is on the wall. It's too late, and this is not the final boss. After a good fight with Miss Bartley, John and Eric make their way to Dracula's resting spot. The problem is that he's awake and angry, looking to get his revenge on the family that killed him 20 years ago. It's the fight we've all been waiting for, and John is finally ready to take over where his father left off. Here's what happens next. There's also a slightly different take on the ending if you beat the game with Eric. This is how his adventure plays out. Okay, so maybe the journey was better than the endings, but at least we got to see the castle crumble in 16 bits. This is a fun little action game that definitely starts better than it ends, and yet another Castlevania ending that disappoints. Perhaps the most interesting element of the game is the journey itself. I added it all up and would have taken John and Eric around 964 hours to take the path they walked. That's 40 days! And even if they managed to catch a ride on a boat or a horse, which is something they didn't even hint at in this game, then it still would have required 2,982 miles of travel. What's especially frustrating is that all of this would have only taken 423 hours of walking if they had just gone straight from Romania to England. That's just under 1,400 miles, which is like half the length. I'm starting to think that maybe I'm fixated on the wrong part of this adventure. Anyway, Castlevania Bloodlines is fun, but the ending isn't great. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Game Over, The Early Years. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every Monday. So here's the question I have for you. Who is your favorite video game villain? Dracula is certainly one of the best villains of all time, but is he the best? I'm excited to see what you come up with in the comments below. In other news, I'm currently hard at work on a bunch of reviews, as well as a feature that looks at the secret lives of the guy who would answer all of the mail in those classic magazines. What does that even mean? Find out later this week, and don't forget to click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here.